Okay, I think we'll get started. Okay, hi everybody. Thanks for joining us for our Humans of Hen webinar hosted by Surgical House. I'm Serge Bellardi. I'm the National Business Development Manager for Surgical House Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the lands on which we are meeting today. As we are meeting virtually, I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where each of us are located and pay my respects to elders past and present. I also extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. A little bit about Surgical House. For those of you who don't know, Surgical House is a family-owned Australian business established in 1980 in Perth, Western Australia. We are a wholesale and retail supplier of healthcare consumables and equipment, distributing Australia-wide from warehouses in both Perth and now in Melbourne. I'm joined today by Cassandra Hamilton, our Business Development Manager in New South Wales and Queensland, and Renee Holdaway, our Customer Relationship Manager in Perth. We are a customer service focused company who pride ourselves in delivering caring and reliable services to people of all ages living with complex and chronic health conditions, and we offer peace of mind to their families and carers. We have many points of differences, including free quotations to assist in better NDIS plan budget outcomes. And to our plan managed customers, we release orders prior plan manager payment, as we know that in our line of work, our customers don't have the luxury of waiting for goods. This week, as you know, is Feeding Tube Awareness Week. In the eyes of the NDIS, a feeding tube is deemed to be a complex consumable item made from polyurethane or silicone. But this week, what we recognise and what we celebrate, that it's actually much, much more. A lifeline that enables children and adults with such needs to grow, thrive and live their lives to the very fullest. Today, we are privileged to have two amazing women in Juliette and Katy, who will be sharing their stories as tube-fed adults. And who better to host this discussion than advanced accredited practicing dietitian and Tubie specialist, Lina Breik, who I had the pleasure of finally meeting in person this week after 2 years of conversing by phone. I will be back later to wrap up and announce our prize winners. But for now, enjoy our Humans for Health Hen webinar. And here's Lina.
Thank you so much for having me, Serge and Surgical House team. And I am so excited today to be joined by Juliette and Katy. I've done some work before in this space with Juliette, so here we are again. But this is the first time Katy and I joined forces. I bumped into her on LinkedIn and Juliette, I think it was Twitter. We bumped into each other. So I am absolutely honored to be facilitating this session all about them and their lives. So welcome everybody. As Serge said, I'm a dietitian. I've been working for about 15 years now, but the last 5 have primarily been in the community home tube feeding session, running my own business. At the giveaway that Serge at the end of this webinar will be drawing 2 winners, I think. Yes, and you guys will win a copy of my book, which is Your Tube, a guide to nutrition through a feeding tube, which I am so proud of, as it was a lot of blood, sweat and tears. But really excited to have you all here with us today talking about, I love this title, The Humans of Hen. There are roughly about 7,122 based on the most recent publication in 2021 by Caroline Flood and colleagues, who across Australia and New Zealand, who live with a home feeding tube or thrive with a home feeding tube, as we like to say it. But that's a very approximate figure, and we know it's a lot more. So if you've got a feeding tube listening to this, we hope you feel so empowered today. If you're a parent with a little kiddie that has a feeding tube, know that their adult life will be filled with beautiful things, and they can live a normal life with a feeding tube. And if you're a clinician supporting someone with a feeding tube, we hope you get out of this session the human aspect of beyond the feeding tube. Juliette and Katy, I'm going to get them each to introduce themselves, and then we're going to move into a bit of a facilitated discussion between us three. We've got some pre-prepared questions, but I promise you we're not scripted. we're going to be talking from the heart. So Juliette, I'll hand over to you first. If you can please just introduce yourself. What are your hobbies and the type of feeding tube you've got? That would be great.
Thanks, Lina. It's exciting to be here. Hi, everyone. I'm Juliette. I live on Butchulla country in regional Queensland. I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I'm speaking to you from today, and also to acknowledge the tube feeding lived experience in the room. I'm a mum of a crazy blended family of 5 kids, 2 of whom have left home for uni, and 2 are in year 12 this year studying hard, and 1 in year 10. So it's a very busy time at home. And I'm also a PhD candidate. I'm studying the psychosocial impact of home tube feeding. It's something that's a little under-researched in my view. I'm also a triathlete and a marathon runner. I'm a health consumer advocate. And I guess if you followed the ads to sign up for this webinar, you probably would have gathered already that I am also tube fed. I live with short bowel syndrome, which is a form of intestinal failure. At the moment, I have a surgically placed low profile G tube, but my team is currently investigating whether a GJ tube might work better for me. We've got lots of pros and cons to work through before we get there. I guess I want to acknowledge up front that every tube feeding journey is unique. Some of the challenges that we face as tubies do seem almost universal, like navigating really complex systemic barriers, NDIS, all of those things. And some are variations on very similar themes, but in my experience of being and engaging with other tube-fed people, there are more things about our respective journeys that are totally unique. So I feel really passionately about sharing my experience as one tube-fed person, but I also like to emphasize every time that I speak that my story is just one of many. And the more that we can listen to, acknowledge, and embrace the diversity of lives fueled by tubes, the more we'll collectively understand about the impact of this medical intervention on individuals and families and communities. So my hope in sharing my own story, and maybe my call to action, I guess, is, if nothing else, is for you to encourage the tubies in your lives to unapologetically tell their stories and to educate through the realities of their lives and the insights that they've gained along the way. I have learned so much from fellow tubies, and I wish I'd heard more stories of lived experience before my tube was placed. I'm excited to be here today and to share a little bit about what my day-to-day tube feeding looks like and how I've adapted my life and my athletic training to the tube, and also why awareness in advocacy in healthcare and community spaces is so important. So whether you're here as a clinician, someone with lived experience, or you just want to learn about tube feeding, I hope that you take away the message that tube feeding doesn't have to mean just surviving. It can be, as Lina said before, a way to thrive. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion. Can't wait to hear the perspectives of my fellow tubie, in particular Katy, who is super inspiring, and I'm hoping will now tell you a little bit more about herself.
Thank you. Oh, how am I going to live up to that expectation? Oh my gosh. Obviously echoing a lot of what Juliette said. And I'm coming from Darawal country, and it's definitely, I think it's important to honour and recognise the original custodians of our land. So I guess with my journey, it keeps cutting out my face. I'm too white apparently. Apparently I've got to move closer to the camera. All the technical difficulties, there we go.
Looks good.
So I started my feeding tube journey in 2023. I currently have a surgical J tube, and where this morning I got the call that my low profile button is in. So next week, exactly, actually it's booked in for this time next week, actually. I'll be getting my low profile tube, which I am very excited for. It will also be going up a size, so that's a bit terrifying. I am a dietitian student, so I did have a bit of an idea sort of when things were going a bit pear-shaped. So I started to get quite unwell towards the end of, I guess, the year, kind of where you're prepping for exams, doing all of like your OSCE, so like I guess, the practical exam kind of side of things. And yeah, things just kept going downhill. Not long after my exams, I had a CT, which confirmed that I have superior mesenteric artery syndrome, which is not a very common thing to have, not something that people usually look for. So I'm very grateful it was found. And yeah, straight away kind of got a call from the gastro to go in, get my NJ tube. And I had that for exactly a year and a day before we transitioned to my surgical tube. And yeah, it's been a bit of a journey. So last year I started my professional placement as well as doing research. So I do my placement part-time. So I'm doing the rest of my placement this year. And yeah, I've finished my research, doing my clinical placement now. So I work on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So it's my day off. And yeah, it's just been great to have a bit of knowledge before I went into it. But also, again, like the lived experience from other people, I'm so grateful that I have cousins as well who have feeding tubes for different reasons. And yeah, being able to talk to other people and actually use them as a resource. And I can then use that in my practice as well as a dietitian, my lived experience and the little tips and tricks you learn along the way that you kind of don't really know unless you've been there before. Yeah, I also like to dance and sing. So I'm very excited to start dancing again Monday. And I sing at church once a month. And that was a bit interesting with an NJ tube, but anything is possible. It didn't limit me at all. Just the initial getting used to it periods for both tubes, because you use your abdominal muscles when you sing. But now that it's sort of recovered, like I don't really have any limitations, which is great. My condition is definitely not one that's well researched, and what is, because it's so rare, and what is kind of known is more what's been sort of like the main cause is from extreme weight loss, not the other stuff. So it's yeah, definitely an area that I hope gets more research, so that we can find ways to help other people with this condition, because it's not fun.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, I honestly think we could probably end the webinar right here, Serge, because I mean, you guys are awesome, and I love just hearing the authenticity in your voices, and it really makes my heart so happy. But I am going to kick things off with one of the very first questions on my list of pre-prepared questions. Juliette, I'll start with you. I think probably a pivotal point is can you take us back to the moment that you learned you were going to need a feeding tube? Can you just talk me through the emotions you felt at that particular moment? Who said it to you? What did they say? How did you feel?
I'm just going to set the context a little bit, if that's okay. I guess I'd had some experiences of one of those Salem sump drainage tubes at various times in the 6 months I spent in hospital after all of my emergency bowel resection surgeries. So for those who don't know, these tubes are huge. They're really rigid. They really hurt. They're nothing like the smaller tubes that are designed just solely for enteral feeding. So that was my experience of a tube. When my treating team initially floated the idea that I might need to leave hospital with a feeding tube, I resisted them. So I was afraid of the idea of going home with a tube. I was so afraid that I just begged them to let me try to sustain myself on oral intake alone. And just kept saying, no, I don't want to go home with one. So I went home without a tube, and I tried very hard to meet all of my nutritional needs without one. I can have oral intake. I was on TPN for a very long time, and then gradually was able to eat a little bit more food. And then I thought, well, therefore, maybe I can do without a tube at all. So long story short, this was disastrous. My physical and mental health deteriorated over time, just as I was refusing to concede defeat over that period of time. And it seems ridiculous now when I look back at it, but it eventually got to a point where I walked into my dietitian's office just uncontrollably sobbing, and I said, I will try the tube. I'm going to cry because I'm remembering how difficult that was to do. And I knew that she'd been waiting for this moment quietly in the background, knowing that it was probably inevitable, but not pushing me either. And I felt like I had somehow failed, I think, in that moment, even though I know this is ridiculous. It's just ridiculous, but that's where my mind went. And we're having a very frank discussion about the impact of that moment. So trying to be as frank and honest as I can about that.
And it was probably what it sounds like. It was that you had the assumption that a tube at home is going to be a big pipe.
Yes.
So it's that moment of education.
Yes.
When the clinicians are coming to say, we think this is what you need, and the language they use to approach that conversation, is it a sorry-filled negative language, or is it a, hey, lots of people do this and it can be okay kind of language? And that maybe would have been your response.
There was definitely an apologetic vibe that I picked up, I think, in the way that they presented it to me. And I think maybe what was underneath a lot of how I felt was my own misconceptions and misunderstandings about tube feeding myself that hadn't been sort of cleared up. So like I said, I'd spent 5 months on TPN, so I knew what it was like to be unable to eat anything at all. And when I regained the ability to kind of eat small amounts, I applied all of this kind of unnecessary pressure to myself, because I thought if I wasn't getting enough food in, now that I could eat, I wasn't trying hard enough. And I think that was just all tied in with these misconceptions I had about what a feeding tube is or should be, and the role that it plays in someone's life. And I felt like there was no excuse to need any kind of medical intervention in the nutritional space at all, because I could now eat orally. So I guess in addition to my initial fear of the tube itself, based on that previous experience of the surgical nasal tube, I thought, the Salem sound. I thought I shouldn't need a tube at all. And you know, I now know that this is wonky thinking. And at the time, though, I was really hard on myself and what I thought was some kind of personal failure. My dietitian was very kind and gentle with me during this moment of concession as I walked into her office just bawling. She had never been pushy, like I said, but was fully supportive once I decided I'd had enough of trying to be needlessly stubborn. So she made arrangements, and within days I had an NG tube. And to be honest, once I started feeds, I felt it was almost instant relief. I could meet my nutritional requirements with far less pain. I wasn't causing myself agony trying to get the food in to an altered anatomy that just couldn't accommodate that sort of volume of food that I was trying to put through. And, also without the effort of feeding myself, taking over an entire day. Because even when I was using supplements and custards and, low volume, high calorie things just to try and get enough in, it was still sipping and nibbling an entire day, and it was just exhausting. But I think when I got that NG, of course I faced all of the usual difficulties and challenges that new tubies face, and adjusting to that learning curve, the trial and error, all the routines of tube feeding, and also the insecurity. The pump beeping, my pet peeve. But also it whirs as well in the background. I was just listening to it as we were waiting for the webinar to start, and there was no sound, and there was just this whirring in the background.
Any manufacturers on the line, we need a silent pump, like
please. I think there's
that's
but anyway.
But
So the other emotions I had, I guess, were really that insecurity that came with having a visible tube on my face. I'm sure Katy will be able to relate to this as well, and she spoke about it around her singing as well in church. And I wonder also whether that played a role for you, Katy. But for me, when I went to work, I was so worried about what my colleagues would think of me, and the assumptions that would be made about why I needed the tube, and if other people like me saw it as a personal failure. I know nobody did, but there were so many kind of ridiculous things that went through my head at the time. And largely those are things that possibly could have been headed off at the pass had someone fully understood what it was like from a psychosocial perspective to have a tube. All the people around me knew how to tell me how to flush the tube, what sort of enteral syringes to use, how many mils, how, what sort of tube feeds I would require, and how to prime a giving set, and all of the technical things that sit alongside and around feeding tubes. But no one said, hey, you might feel a bit of grief. You might feel a bit like a failure. You might feel like, I don't think necessarily we should be preempting how people feel and telling them how they feel. I'm not saying that, but at the same time, acknowledging that however you feel, other people have been there before, share that, and will help walk with you through that, because it can be difficult. So yeah, that was, I guess, the emotional side of that very early part of my tube feeding journey.
I love that. Yeah, I'm sorry you had to feel that way, feeling like you're a failure. I think whilst I don't have a feeding tube, but I think a lot of people on the line, myself included, can probably relate to that from a perspective of C-sections. I had a C-section for my first child, and I remember feeling like a failure.
Yeah, I had 3 too.
It wasn't a normal birth. And
yes, it's a good analogy, Lina. It is.
I remember being so frustrated, going, why am I filling out the paperwork that I didn't have a normal birth? This is crazy. And I felt like my body failed me because I had a C-section. But I know that's
having been through both of those experiences, I think that's a fair analogy, actually.
Yeah,
a good one.
Yeah. Thank you. Katy, tell me, the moment you got your feeding tube, 2023, so not too far long ago.
Yeah, I definitely relate so much to what Juliette was saying, and just so much gaslighting. Like, when you can have some oral intake, it's like, oh, it's all in my head. I don't actually need the tube. I just need to push harder. I just need to do this. I just need to do that. And it's just like, okay, well, even what my fluid requirements, because I have POTS, I need a lot of fluid.
Yeah.
So if I can only get, on a good day, 1.5 liters, that's half of like my minimum. So, and then all of that is essentially have to be supplements. And I'm like, oh no, I just have to try harder. I have to push myself until I'm literally crippled in pain. And then I know that it's hard enough. And I could even be doing that. There could be days where I'm literally on the floor, not on the fetal position, because that doesn't help, but like on all fours, trying to like relieve the pressure and the pain. And mum would be like, that's kind of like that's your limit. Like, you realize, and try to like rationalize it with me and remind me that it's like, it's not in my head. Like, I'm literally in excruciating pain when I try. But still there's that voice in your head, like, and especially with that dietetic knowledge, you're like, oh, well, the things to do. You should do this. You should do this. And it's like, yeah, that's great. And when I didn't have the tube because it blocked or whatever, or before I got my tube, I was doing all those things, and it's not enough. And to sort of gaslight myself into thinking I didn't try hard enough, it's like, well, you were there, you did. So yeah, I think that it can be easy to just sort of think you just need to try harder, when it's like, well, no, your physiology says otherwise. There's an actual issue. It's not a mental thing. And even if it is a mental thing, that's not invalid. It's still a real issue, and it's genuine.
Absolutely.
Like, it's not easy to overcome. So
absolutely.
I just, resonate so much with that. And even I did have some time on the wards as well. So when I had the NJ tube last year, so I was doing food service placement, and I did some community and public health placement. And, I did have one patient ask, what's the thing in your nose? I'm like, stomach's broken. It's the easiest way to explain it. Like, it's how I get my food and drink, because it's broke. And she's like, cool. And it's so simple. And I do get a fair few people asking, and I don't actually mind too much, like, when people ask, because as humans we are curious. But I also know that a lot of people do find it like, you don't ask people about, why are you in a wheelchair, or, I mean, some people do, but still, it's like, that is personal, medical information that you're not entitled to. So I understand when people are defensive, because it is private information, but I'm pretty open about it, so I don't mind. So I'm lucky in that sense that part didn't bother me too much. And especially like when you see like little kids kind of like really curious, I'm just like, oh, that's so cute. Or when you have another kid with a feeding tube and the kid sees you, or the parent with a baby with a feeding tube and they see you with a feeding tube, like those little moments they're so lovely to have those little, like, I see you moments. But yeah. And then like the assumptions of like, there's a lot of like, oh, if you have a feeding tube, you have an eating disorder kind of vibes.
Yes.
It's like, I would probably be inpatient in a hospital and not necessarily left to my own devices. Not necessarily, but it's quite likely if that was the cause, I wouldn't be out here doing my thing. But there can be, it's like, there's just so little knowledge about, there's so many things that are not visible that can impact someone's ability to eat. So yeah, just so much of that resonated. And when I first found out, so I kind of saw it coming as a student dietitian in my, third year of honours. So we'd already learnt about feeding tubes and all those wonderful things. And I was struggling with my oral intake. So obvious thing, I'm just like, cool, well, I'm just going to buy some of the sausage and hospital formula. That's going to be, take that to school with me. That's great. And, so I was sort of working with what I could, and I could still have the adequate amount of fluids. Everything was fine. And then, it sort of just started to get a bit worse, and then I couldn't have as many fluids. I started having solid food intolerance. Towards the end, a bit of dysphagia. I remember exactly, it was like, I think it's December 8th, tried to eat some pizza, and that was really difficult. And so, yeah, it was getting progressively worse, and just having the supplement and having it sort of come semi up. Yeah. I'm just like, okay, well, I can see that I'm not getting enough energy. I'm losing weight. I'm trying my best, so I can see a feeding tube in my future if it doesn't resolve, because I've been known to have issues and it resolves within 2 weeks, and it had just gotten worse. And I'm like, cool, well, I'm probably going to have a feeding tube, and it's going to be an NJ, because clearly the stomach is not where it's at. So it's going to have to be a J tube. So I kind of saw it coming. Okay. And then when I got the diagnosis, but it still was so confronting, because, you learn in class all these things, but it's so different when you actually have it. I'm like, oh yeah, it's an NJ. So I'm going to have a really teeny tiny tube. It's going to be not too bad. Not the case. Because you do have to start with like a larger French, especially for a J tube, because they clog. And I didn't know that, that's not the book knowledge that I necessarily had. That's experience and living knowledge. Yeah. And so I remember venting to my dietitian, like, because I'd taken someone else's spot that they'd, had some coffee before anesthesia, which you can't do. So I got in. So I'm like, they gave me the wrong tube. They didn't swap out. They gave me his tube. They should, like, I had no idea. Like, I was fully venting and losing my mind. And she was just so patient and just sat there, and she didn't correct me. I'm like, why didn't you correct me when I was being a complete idiot? Like, please just correct me when I'm incorrect. You vent. I'm the nerd. Yeah. And then later I learned, I'm like, oh, my poor dietitian. So patient, so understanding, just listened. And yeah, it was definitely a lot different to what I expected it to be. And then all the learning curves that you have. And I'm so grateful that my dietitian also let me know about, like, more portable pumps versus other pumps, because there's so many different kinds. And, giving me the autonomy to sort of choose what fit around my life, and recognizing that I am someone who goes out and does things, who will go on placement and dance and sing, like seeing the whole person and offering that, which was just amazing. But it's like, I had no idea about all these things. Like, I just, learned calculations and stuff, like what Juliette was saying, the calculations, the feeds, all that stuff. But everything else was brand new, and like
the world of options, absolutely, to make life easier.
And troubleshooting and everything. Like, it's just like, is this normal? Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, this part is normal. And I found Reddit being a great spot. And there's like a feeding tube paid like thread on Reddit, which I will consistently go to get advice or even help others, because they're like, I'm about to get this. Experiences, obviously, no medical advice is given, or it's just like, this is our experience. Yours may differ. And it's very like understanding, and like, you should see a doctor or talk to this person about that, because it might be this, it might not, we don't know, but you should talk to your person. So
Yeah.
found that's
I
been
love
really
that.
great. And
Yeah.
there's a page on Facebook as well for Australian feeding tubes, which again, it's having that community that can give you a bit more insight, because it's
and I think as clinicians, we're traditionally, we cringe when we hear our clients are going on Facebook and Reddit, but I actually think we should encourage it and bring it up first and say, hey, you can still swim, you can be a mum, you can run a marathon, you can finish a university degree and above, and you can, with a feeding tube, and you can see all these people on these different social media groups, but don't change anything with your nutrition regimen until you talk to me, just so I know or it's safe.
Anything like that is always, we cannot recommend anything about it's like contact your dietitian. Like, we can't do anything like that. Like, I had someone mentioning something. I'm like, look, I'm not I'm not your dietitian. I don't know why your dad's put it on there. If you're concerned, talk to the dietitian.
But this is my experience, and there's so much power in that experience, and that experience is absolutely, I think it's Aussie Tubie Mates is the Facebook group, one that's huge. Yeah, there's Aussie Tubie
one. I need to go join that one.
Yeah. But yeah, so in the clinicians in the house, let's not cringe at social media, because I've definitely heard of social media doing wonders for Tubie people, in terms of helping them.
Oh, sorry.
So go.
Putting in the safety measures of like what you can and can't do based on like what social media does, like what role it plays, like setting up the safety rather than, you know, cringing at it, set up the safety and prepare for it.
Yeah, and bring it up first. Absolutely. I love that. Moving on to triathlons and marathons, Juliette, I just think it's so bloody cool that you are a marathon runner with a feeding tube. How did you run with a pump? Can you give me the imagery of how that happened? What did you wear?
Sorry, the last part of the question just was breaking up. I think there was just an issue with the connection. Could you repeat that, please, Lina?
I just said, can you paint me a picture of how you fueled your body during the marathon? How did you run with a pump?
Yes. Sure. So I realized I was going to need nutrition on a longer run, anything longer than a sort of a 1 hour session of intense physical activity, according to my dietitian and my, my level of malnutrition at the time. I really needed to have some kind of nutrition running, or, to be able to replace lost electrolytes and things like that, because my body loses things like potassium very quickly and doesn't absorb it readily because I'm missing 90% of my small bowel. It means that I just don't absorb fluids and nutrients the way that a typical athlete would. So I investigated myself like a range of different ways of rigging up my feeding tube and running with it, and some worked better than others, but I ended up going to STARS, which is the rehabilitation arm of sort of the Royal Brisbane and Women's Hospital, where I get most of my care, I guess, being the tertiary hospital in Queensland. And I just asked their engineers, I said, they're medical engineers who do things like arranging seating assessments and things like that for wheelchairs and other kinds of equipment needs for people with disabilities. And I thought, well, maybe they'd be able to help me. I rely on a piece of equipment to keep me well nourished and hydrated, and the equipment that I have doesn't really lend itself very well to the kind of life I want to live and the activities that I want to do. They weren't designed for running marathons, but I wonder whether with these clever minds at the hospital, we might be able to come up with something. So they created a feeding tube running vest for me. So we started with one of those hydration vests that a lot of ultramarathon runners use. And then we adapted it so that I'll show you. I don't know if you'll be able to see it because of the background, but this is my vest here, and they created this little clip-on.
So this is the biomedical engineers.
This is what they came up with at the hospital. Yeah.
Super cool.
So it's quite simple in it. Like, its simplicity is actually what makes it so brilliant, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, and this is made of a neoprene material. So without that, that's just your normal running vest for an ultra marathon runner. And you put your fluids in there, and you would have your liquid delivered via a straw if you were on a 100K run. But for me, I attach my pump. I put it into this little zippable container here. I've got little Velcro patches over the buttons, the start, go, and the buttons for changing the rate of my feed. So I still do have to reach around and try and locate those buttons. So it's not an ideal solution, but it does help me to use it. And my feeds.
But if your watch talks to your pump.
That's my biggest. I want a smartwatch enabled feeding pump. And you know what, Lina? How helpful would that be for mums with babies? Like, I'm just like, when my children were little and they got to sleep, I wanted nobody to disturb them. I cannot imagine, because none of my babies were Tubies, having to put your baby to sleep and then walk out of the room and have a pump alarm go off and wake them up. That, to me, I just am like, how do you deal? I would not deal. Imagine if you're a mum with a smartwatch and you could just get some haptic feedback to say, oh, there's a occlusion alarm or air in the line, and you could sneak back into baby's room and fix it. But for me, my selfish desire for a smartwatch enabled pump is really about being able to change the rate of my feeds whilst I'm running a marathon. So there's a range of different applications for improving the equipment that we use, and I really hope at some point I get to speak to somebody who can actually design and do something about this. If you're out there, let's talk.
Manufacturers on the line. There's got to be.
That's it.
With the consumers now.
That's it. Yeah. So there's a bunch of things on this tube that this vest that allow me to wrangle my tube feeding equipment. So obviously giving sets are quite long when you're running a marathon beside a bunch of other people, and you're trying to push past and make it past, to the finish line ahead of them all. You run the risk of having them get tangled up in your tubing. So there's lots of little things that are designed just to keep control of the tubing, keep it out of the way. It's quite clever. So I won't go into a lot of detail, but that's how I run with this thing. And it's something that was done in partnership with these engineers.
Yeah, I love it. I don't know if we've got any engineers on the line, but thank you guys if you're out there. You guys are super important in the hospital world. I guess the take-home message for you, Juliette, from your experience is you had to kind of invent something that's not around, and we need it. We need more life-friendly Tubie equipment.
I went to a lot of these forums that Katy was talking about and said, does anyone have a solution to this problem? And they're all like, you're doing what? No. Yeah.
Because tube feeding's traditionally seen as a medical hospital, sick person, overnight, 24-hour feeds. And then the moment you want to put grandma's beetroot, the tube discolors, and then it looks disgusting. And you just want to put grandma's beetroot.
Can I say though, like sometimes I feel a little bit like I'm a superhero though, as I wear my like tube feeding running vest and I sprint past these hydration stations that all of the poor athletes who are reliant on oral nutrition have to stop and swig the water. I just give them a little wave. I'm like, just to encourage them to overcome their challenges. As I'm like, see you at the finish line, don't have to stop. Thanks.
So good.
I love it. Katy, what is it like needing a tube feed while you're in the middle of a lecture theatre at uni? What do you do? Do you just whip out your tube, you whip out your blend or whatever it is you got with you? How do you go about it?
I think it's also a superpower as well. Like my nieces are like so ecstatic that I can we'll walk to the car and it's like you're eating and drinking at the same time while you're talking and walking, like it's pretty cool. With that, so I often do my feeds overnight, but I do need water during the day. But I have had to run a bit late, and so I had to take food to the lecture. And I can just stick it in like a smaller sort of container. Or I've had, like, you can get the little pouches, which are amazing. There's a few brands that do them, and they kind of end up being like, you get all the air out. And so it doesn't, if you move or whatever, like it doesn't have to be hung a certain way or anything like that. So it's way more portable, and also like it's a bit more smushable. So you don't have to be like, oh, this takes up a big chunk of my bag. Yeah, you get smaller bags. Mine's down over there. because you don't have to buy an expensive bag, I just modified my own. I sewed in used some ribbon and sewed that into the lining. So then that has extra support. And then I can just hook my feet into there if I've got one that needs to hang. Otherwise, the pouches can just sit wherever. They're pretty chill. And that stops the whole giving step from kinking and then yelling at you because there's an occlusion. It's great. And so I've had where I had a backup thing filled. That was like a smaller container, and then my pouch. And then once the pouch was empty, I just put in the backup feed just to top it up and just kept going. And you can just do that in the lecture theatre. Like I was just in the back, not an issue. And if I have to flush, sometimes I'll have a preloaded syringe, and the cap that comes on the giving set, I might just stick that on the end of the syringe so it kind of protects it leaking.
Ready to go.
Yeah, it's ready to go. Just whip it out. Otherwise, you know, I'll just excuse myself, get some water, and off we go. So yeah, and we usually got breaks. So in the little break, I'd just sort of do any maintenance I had to do, and back in we go. Any alarms, it's kind of like they don't, you know, people's mobiles go off all the time or whatever. So like, it's not seen as an issue. Like, yeah, and even at work, like people go to the bathroom or get a drink, like it's the same. It's just mine looks different, but I'm doing the same stuff, and they're always really considerate about like what my needs are and working around it. But generally, you know how long your feed's going to run or how much you need. So I'm like, okay, cool. If I start work at this time, I need my feed to finish by this time. So I'm going to start it at this time because I know it takes this long. And you just do that with anything. You're like, all right, cool. This is what I want to do. So I'm going to change my routine to fit into my life. And
yeah,
it's worked pretty well so far.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And I mean, the great thing, you guys are vocal, you're able to advocate for yourselves. And that's what makes things, I guess, easier in the Tubie life to navigate the healthcare and navigate your regimens. I can't help but think and send a huge hug to all those Tubies out there that may not have the ability to voice all of this. And this is where us as manufacturers and clinicians or carers really need to dive deep into the human beyond the tube and think, what would they like to do? Would they like to be bloated for 16 hours of the day, or would they like little breaks of nutrition? Would they like a funky bag that's Mickey Mouse printed or not? So anyone out there, check out Tubie Fun for some really cool bags and pads and stoma patches and things. But talking about navigating healthcare, Juliette, I guess, what has been your experience, you know, not having a clinician background? What's been your experience with navigating the healthcare space?
Honestly, it's a very difficult thing, I think, for anyone with complex medical needs. Systemic barriers and the realities of navigating this complex and largely under-resourced health system, along with like issues like the culture of medical training and medical culture generally, and medical models, and all of those things that sit alongside medical intervention like tube feeding can create a lot of unnecessary barriers. But I've been lucky to have a lot of great individual healthcare professionals in my corner. So I guess I don't want to, I won't spend too much time describing the barriers because I think we understand them, most people in this room. But the thing that I do myself is to remind myself that I deserve to take up space and to have my needs met. And that even if I'm worried about being perceived as too pushy or too strident or annoying, healthcare professionals are very busy people, I know, but I remind myself that I don't have to exist solely in those like spaces between the things that are more important to other people. I'm allowed to say, this is important to me, this is important to my life. And in healthcare, this means being really persistent, asking questions, sometimes getting second opinions, sometimes triangulating information using trusted sources. And then, yeah, I think that's probably what I would say, because I'm trying to keep it short because I know that we're running short of time and there's so much to talk about. Katy, what would you say?
Yeah.
I've been really, really lucky that I have an amazing support team. And I think it really does depend who your team is and where you are, and how much training and experience they have in that area, and the advocacy and the communication between the teams. Like, it is really, there's so many things that can create barriers. And if some of them aren't existing, then that does make it easier, which for me, I've been so, so lucky. Any issues, there's always someone who has problem solved a solution. So, you know, if one person doesn't listen, I can go to like another member of my team, but that's unlikely to ever happen, unless they've said, look, I'm not experienced enough, go ask that person. But yeah, for me, it's sort of like, I know what my needs are, and I do have to be quite firm on it, which I'm not great at, but they often call my team if there's any issues or urgencies, and they will then advocate for me, so I don't have to. So they're really good at fighting for their patients, thankfully.
I love that. So for those on the line the clinicians on the line that may not have much experience with tube feeding, you can still support someone with a feeding tube. Make sure, though, you've got a mentor to sort of help you troubleshoot and guide a little bit quicker. So what I'm hearing from you guys is just those clinicians that are knowledgeable in this space is what's helpful. Before we wrap up, I just have one final question that I think is a super fun one. What's one assumption you think people have about tube feeding that you'd love to change?
Do you want me to go first?
Go.
I guess, and one, you're always restricting me to one, Lina. You know me too well. I guess I would say one of the assumptions that people make is that having a feeding tube is like an end of life kind of measure. Like Katy was mentioning earlier in the webinar, that it's related to an eating disorder or some sort of serious issue that indicates your life is over or coming to an end, or that its focus is on just surviving. And I really want people to see that you can thrive with a feeding tube. And while sometimes the physical illnesses that lead to tube feeding can and do present their own limitations and challenges, the tube itself shouldn't represent a barrier to adventure and passion and fun and all the wonderful things that life has to offer. It's not the end of a life, it's just a different way of fueling one.
I love that. Katy, what's one assumption you've heard and what would you like to change?
I mean, that's one of them, but I guess as well that anyone of any size can need a feeding tube. It's not just for people who are very small, and you can be malnourished as well at any size. And just because
That's
someone
the
has a feeding
dietitian
tube,
speaking. Stop.
But just because someone has a feeding tube, like, you know, obviously we can still sometimes eat, sometimes you can't, but you know, it's not necessarily, oh, we're trying to make them gain weight or, you know, reverse malnutrition. It's sometimes getting nutrition. And so, yeah, I guess that there's just so many reasons, and any size, any person, anyone can have one.
Yeah, I love that. That is beautiful. Thank you so much, ladies, for your candid reflections, your authenticity. It's hard. It's hard to come on and speak live about something that a time when you were really, really vulnerable. And probably, as Juliette said, almost tearing earlier, it's hard to constantly be taken back to that difficult moment of life. But we really appreciate you guys showing our audience how your beautiful, varied, rich, thriving lives and your feeding tube is a tool that helps you get there. And that's exactly what we want to hear. Serge, over to you.
Oh, thanks, Lina. Thanks, Juliette and Katy. That was amazing. I think that story about running past the hydration station in a marathon, that's you're gonna be pulled up for cheating one day, I reckon. They'll very like complaining about you. I think Lina mentioned to me about, you know, we live in an age where technology is changing so rapidly, but it's too slow in this industry. And with young people like yourselves, and while youth is not a barrier for innovation, but you guys are probably going to be the beacons for for change, you know, and I think more people like you speak out, companies will be forced to come to the 21st century, and I think it makes sense. I think there's so many, you know, parents out there with kids of, you know, who are tube fed, who'll be going, wow, let's get this done ASAP, you know. So great guys, that was really inspirational. So I guess we come to the stage of our prizes, and then we'll wrap up with Lina later on. But our first prize is a free arm donated by Australian distributor Intermed Medical. These products are amazing. Now, Lina is a big advocate for these, and she always makes sure they're included in her quote request when she comes to Surgical House to get, you know, her complete, you know, yearly product list for her participants. So have a look at it. They come in 4 colors. There's a new one out now, but they are a great tool. You can get them on the NDIS, so make sure that you inquire about it, and we're happy to help you out with that with that process. So, okay, so this is going only people who are sort of people who are participants or carers and parents who are eligible for this prize. So we've got the spinning wheel up for the free arm. So Caitlin Bender is our winner of the free arm. So we'll ensure that Caitlin gets her free arm, and we'll make sure she gets it in the colour of her choice. So we do have some different colours there to offer. So that's well done, Caitlin. We now come to the draws for the 2 books kindly donated by Lina. These books are titled Your Tube, A Guide to Nutrition Through a Feeding Tube, published in November 23 and available on Amazon. So everybody's in the draw for these books. It's amazing books, and obviously, as Lina said, she's put her heart and soul into these books. So let's spin the wheel, and everyone's eligible for this one here. So let's spin the wheel for the first winner of this book. Okay, first winner is Tam Lack. Well done. So we'll be in touch with that one. And now for book number 2.
Oh,
Rebecca Jane. Well done,
awesome.
Rebecca. So we'll be in touch with that one as well. So yeah, so well done to all our prize winners. Just over to you, Lina, for any wrap-ups or any last words and remarks.
No, I thank you all for attending, and for those of you who couldn't make the live, thank you for watching the recording. Katy and Juliette are both on LinkedIn, and so am I, and all 3 of us are very happy to be contacted through there if you've got any questions or just want to say thank you for the few words that may have resonated with you. We are needy. We like that affirmation as well. But what we really hope everyone on the line is able to close today and think, and not pity feeding Tubies, but rather encourage them that they can swim, they can run, they can be mums, they can do university, they can do everything. It's just lots of teething issues at the start, but it's a beautiful way to nourish a life that would otherwise have a much more difficult nourishment journey. So empowerment to Tubies is the message.
Thanks, Lina. Thank you, Juliette and Katy. And thanks to all of you who are attending today. I'd just like to wrap up by saying that we do have another seminar coming up on February 19. It's one of the things that Lina's passionate about, and so are we. And we will have two of our suppliers on that discussion with Nutrition and Avanos. Is about getting the right products in your annual list. You know, so make sure you got the right amounts of. You know, if you need the correct number of Mickey buttons, the right number of feed sets, the right number of nutritional products. It's about advocating and making sure that you're properly budgeted as per manufacturer's recommendations. So that's going to be a discussion around there. And I know Lina is really going to be passionate about that one. So we'll be there on the February 19th. So please register now. Once again, I'd like to thank my team at Surgical House. And if you need anything today to follow up on any discussion around getting quoting or helping you getting the best in your plans and with product knowledge and availability, etc., please contact myself or Cassandra Hamilton in New South Wales, ACT or Queensland, and obviously Renee Holdaway, our Brains Trust in Perth, WA. So that's all for me. Thanks so much for attending this Humans of Hens webinar today, and we look forward to seeing you in the future. Have a great day. Be safe. And yes, be well. Thank you.